A graduate student enters a lab meeting and finds their place beside a sensitive project quietly cleared before anyone asks them a question. The searches are accurate, yet those facts create a false professional identity after leaving the relationship that gave them meaning. The ethical failure is not fabricated information. It is accurate information detached from its purpose, audience, and original relationship, then used for another judgment. A true fact can misrepresent someone when its new audience lacks the context and standing needed to interpret what the fact meant. Truthfulness, therefore, does not settle legitimacy. A disclosure can be factually exact while the practical identity built from it is ethically misleading. Imagine a deliberately constructed scenario, not a claim about any university or product. A graduate student privately researches support for a sibling with gambling problems. Later, an automated assistant summarizes the student's recent research interests for a lab meeting. It includes the gambling searches but not their family purpose. The summary does not accuse anyone. The human supervisor supplies the interpretation, treating the search topic as evidence about the student's own conduct. Without asking for context, the supervisor removes the student from a project involving financial records. Accurate disclosure has produced a false practical identity. Nothing in the scenario requires the searches to be false. The wrong emerges because one setting supplies facts while another setting supplies their meaning. The interpretive setting supplies force. Accuracy describes correspondence between a record and an event. Fair representation asks whether the event justifies this interpretation and this treatment here. Accuracy answers only one question. Privacy is often reduced to secrecy, but secrecy is only one boundary. Information may be known and still remain limited to a particular purpose. Purpose still governs appropriate use. Confidentiality adds a relational duty. Information received through one role should not automatically become material for another role's judgment. Roles carry distinct obligations. Contextual integrity goes further. It asks whether information moves according to the purpose, audience relationship, and expectations that made the exchange appropriate. Context makes those limits legible. The same information can therefore be proper in one relationship and misleading in another. Meaning travels with social context, not with content alone. Transfer can alter practical meaning. Purpose is the first boundary. The student searches to support someone else, so the inquiry records an act of assistance rather than self-disclosure. Assistance is the relevant action. Remove that purpose and the search topic becomes radically ambiguous. It might concern research, care, curiosity, prevention, criticism, or personal experience. Ambiguity survives factual precision. The system transfers content, but the supervisor converts ambiguity into a single identity claim. That interpretive narrowing is a human and institutional choice. Narrowing creates the identity claim. Interpretive authority matters because audiences are not equally entitled to settle what information says about a person in a new role. Standing is relational, not automatic. The power difference turns interpretation into treatment. The student can be reclassified by someone who controls access to valued professional work. Authority makes interpretation consequential. Context collapse is therefore more than exposure. It is the conversion of incomplete information into consequential identity by an audience with power to act. Exposure becomes institutional classification. Audience is the second boundary. Information offered to family, a clinician, a teacher, or a colleague enters relationships with different legitimate expectations. Audience changes legitimate expectations. A fact shared with one audience does not arrive pre-authorized for another. New access needs its own justification tied to the receiving role. Access requires a fresh reason. Relationship is the third boundary. Roles create duties, vulnerabilities, and forms of trust that change what responsible use requires. Power reshapes responsible interpretation. A sibling may interpret concern through shared history. A supervisor may see risk through institutional responsibility. Neither perspective is interchangeable with the other. Perspective does not equal permission. Contestability is the fourth boundary. If information enters a new context, the person needs a practical opportunity to explain its origin before treatment changes. Challenge must precede consequence. Without contestability, contextual error hardens into institutional fact. Later decisions may inherit the first interpretation even when the original record stayed accurate. Inherited error can compound. These four boundaries form a test: original purpose, intended audience, role relationship, and opportunity to contest the new interpretation. The test restores missing structure. Start with purpose. Ask what action produced the information and what goal made collecting or sharing it appropriate at that moment. Origins constrain later meaning. Then test audience. Ask who was expected to receive the information and whether the new audience serves a compatible function. Compatibility must be demonstrated. Next, examine relationship. Ask what power the recipient holds and what vulnerability appears when information crosses into that role. Power reveals the vulnerability. Finally, test contestability. Ask whether the person can correct meaning before the new interpretation affects access. Reputation or opportunity response protects contextual accuracy. A transfer that fails several boundaries may remain accurate yet become ethically unreliable as a basis for treatment. Reliability here includes contextual fit. Contextual fit completes reliability. Responsibility remains human. The assistant moves selected information under a design. People decide the selection rules, receiving audience, and institutional consequences. Selection embeds human responsibility. Design responsibility concerns which context travels with the fact. A category without purpose or source relationship invites confident interpretation from thin material. Thin categories invite overreach. Institutional responsibility concerns action. Even a richer summary should not silently convert into exclusion when a person cannot answer the interpretation. Review must precede exclusion. Proportionality also matters. A weak contextual link should not carry the same authority for minor personalization and major professional exclusion. Consequences scale the burden. Minimum necessary transfer reduces interpretive drift. If a coordination task needs a broad subject, intimate supporting details may add vulnerability without relevant value. Restraint limits unnecessary exposure. Together, context preservation, human review, proportionality, and contestability make truthful information less likely to become a false practical identity. Safeguards preserve contextual legitimacy. There is a serious counterpoint. Information sometimes needs to cross contexts for safety, continuity, coordination, or preventing a clearly defined misuse. A blanket rule against transfer could fragment legitimate care or hide patterns that no single role can see. Contextual integrity is not contextual isolation. This limits the thesis. Crossing boundaries is not automatically wrongful. The ethical question is whether the new purpose and authority are justified and constrained. Consider a constructed emergency. A technician discovers an equipment fault that could endanger the next shift. Sharing beyond the immediate team may be warranted. The exception works because relevance is direct, the purpose is compatible, the audience can act, and the scope remains tied to the hazard. The correction is not secrecy at any cost, it is disciplined transfer. Relevant purpose, appropriate audience, bounded authority, and a route to challenge misuse. An ordinary validating case is project continuity. A departing researcher may pass task history to a replacement when both share the same work purpose. Yet additional data does not ensure fair interpretation. More context can help, but the receiving role may still lack standing to make a particular judgment. We can now answer the opening question. Truthful information becomes false representation when a new context converts a fact into treatment it cannot justify. First, ask whether the receiving use matches the original purpose. If not, the transfer needs a separate reason rather than borrowed legitimacy. Second, ask whether the audience has interpretive standing. Access to information does not by itself create authority to define what that information means. Third, examine role, power, and consequence. The greater the recipient's control over another person's opportunities, the stronger the case for restraint and review. Fourth, require contestability before consequential treatment. Correction after exclusion may come too late to prevent the first interpretation from shaping later decisions. The complete context test is purpose, audience, relationship, and contestability. It judges the authority attached to information rather than treating truth as permission. Fair representation therefore requires more than correct data. It requires a justified path from fact to interpretation, and from interpretation to treatment. Ethical memory should preserve or respect the boundaries that gave information meaning. When those boundaries change, its authority should be reconsidered rather than assumed. When evaluating a system, ask where the information began, who received it, what role power changed, and whether the person could answer. Do not ask merely whether sharing was accurate. Ask whether the new use preserves the conditions required for fair interpretation and meaningful challenge. Then separate correction from erasure. Restoring context may repair representation even when the accurate record remains, because the problem was unauthorized meaning. But that leaves another question. If information is deleted after the damage, has the relationship actually released the person from the judgment already made? Truth can survive a context change while fairness does not. The machine is learning. The question is, what are we teaching it?